Julian Ashford stared through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, watching the city lights flicker like fragile little diamonds. He hated the elite society of this city. Tonight, the board of Ashford Group had given him an ultimatum. His grandfather's will was clear and unbreakable. Julian had 30 days to marry a woman of proper standing, an heiress of their social circle, or the controlling shares of the family empire would pass to his scheming cousin. Elliot Graves, his right-hand man, poured a glass of aged scotch and slid it across the cold marble counter. Elliot asked who the lucky bride was going to be, casually mentioning that Vanessa Sterling had been calling the private office all week. Julian scoffed, the sound sharp in the quiet room. He had rejected Vanessa a year ago, when he realized she was entirely in love with his stock portfolio and completely indifferent to him. He told Elliot firmly that he was rejecting every single heiress on that list. He absolutely refused to hand his life and his company over to a corporate merger disguised as a marriage. The next evening, the annual Sterling Capital Charity Gala was suffocatingly dull. Julian stood in the shadowy corner of the ballroom, exhausted by the desperate glances of wealthy mothers trying to push their diamond-draped daughters into his line of sight. That was when he saw her. Sienna Hayes balanced a heavy silver tray of champagne flutes, her hands aching from a brutal double shift. After losing her corporate job under highly suspicious circumstances a few months prior, she had been forced to take any catering gig she could find just to keep a roof over her head. She kept her eyes focused on the floor, wearing the standard black uniform of the service staff, but her posture held a quiet, unshakable dignity that simply did not belong in a servant's uniform. Vanessa Sterling, desperate for attention and furious that Julian was ignoring her, intercepted Sienna near the massive ice sculpture. Vanessa purposefully stepped into Sienna's path, bumping her shoulder hard. A single glass tipped over, spilling cold champagne directly onto Vanessa's designer shoes. Vanessa shrieked loudly, the sound echoing through the hall, and immediately demanded that the catering manager fire Sienna on the spot. Instead of cowering or begging for forgiveness, Sienna held her ground. She looked directly into Vanessa's furious eyes and stated with perfect icy calm that the marble floor was clearly slippery and that throwing a public tantrum would not dry the shoes any faster. The surrounding guests gasped in collective shock. Furious, Vanessa raised her hand as if to strike the waitress across the face. Julian stepped in instantly, catching Vanessa's wrist mid-air. He tightened his grip just enough to send a warning, telling Vanessa in a low, dangerous voice that her behavior was embarrassing them all. Before Vanessa could recover from the sheer shock of his intervention, Julian turned his full attention to Sienna. He did not see a mere waitress trembling in fear. He saw fierce defiance. He saw a woman who couldn't be bought, bullied or intimidated by the heavy weight of the Sterling name. He turned to the catering manager and announced that Sienna was no longer working the event. Without waiting for permission, he took Sienna's hand, feeling the rough calluses on her fingers, and led her out of the crowded ballroom, leaving the high society crowd in absolute, stunned silence. Outside, breathing in the cool night air, Sienna pulled her hand away sharply. She glared at him, demanding to know what he thought he was doing, stating clearly that she needed that catering job to survive. Julian leaned casually against his waiting town car. He looked her up and down, calculating the risk. He offered her a different job right there on the sidewalk, a temporary one. He laid out the terms of a very specific contract, 6 months of marriage. She would live in his penthouse, attend his corporate events, and pretend to be entirely devoted to him in front of the press. In exchange, she would receive $2 million deposited directly into an offshore account on the exact day their divorce was finalized. Sienna laughed, a bitter and hollow sound. She told him he was completely out of his mind. She turned on her heel to walk away, firmly refusing to be a pawn in whatever twisted game a bored billionaire was playing. Julian watched her walk down the street, deeply impressed by her absolute lack of greed. No one walked away from that kind of money. He pulled out his phone, called Elliot, and told him to draft the paperwork immediately and find out absolutely everything there was to know about Sienna Hayes. 2 days later, Sienna sat in the cold, grey boardroom of the Ashford Group. The bitter irony of the situation was not lost on her. This was the exact same building she had been escorted out of by security only 6 months ago. She swallowed hard, hiding the slight tremor in her hands beneath the table. The medical bills for her grandmother were piling up on her kitchen counter, and the bright pink eviction notice on her apartment door had left her with absolutely no choice. Julian slid the heavy parchment contract across the polished mahogany table. He kept his voice completely devoid of emotion, telling her there would be no romance, no physical expectations, and no questions asked about his personal business. Sienna picked up the heavy gold pen. She did not look at the money. Instead, she looked him right in the eye and added her own strict condition. She told him he would not control her words, her clothes, or her dignity. If he wanted a silent, obedient puppet, he could go crawling back to Vanessa. Julian felt a strange, unfamiliar flicker of respect warming his chest. He nodded in agreement. Sienna signed her name on the dotted line. The wedding was a painfully sterile affair held in a drab judge's chamber, attended only by Elliot and a hired photographer sworn to secrecy. Sienna wore a simple, elegant vintage dress she had purchased at a local thrift store, having flatly refused the extravagant designer gown Julian had ordered for her. When the judge told them they could share their first kiss, Julian leaned in close, catching the faint scent of vanilla in her hair. Sienna turned her head slightly at the last second, letting his lips brush only against her cheek. It was cold, calculated, and perfectly contractual. Moving into the massive penthouse felt like stepping into a beautiful gilded prison. For the first 2 weeks, they barely spoke a word to each other. They moved around the massive apartment like two ghosts, carefully avoiding eye contact. But the forced proximity slowly began to fray their defensive edges. One late evening, Julian came home exhausted from a grueling, hostile board meeting. He walked into the dim kitchen and froze. He found Sienna sitting cross-legged on the cold floor, surrounded by highly complex financial documents she had pulled from his open briefcase. She was furiously scribbling notes, fixing a glaring mathematical error in a quarterly projection report. He demanded to know exactly what she was doing. Sienna did not flinch at his tone. She pointed a pen at the paper, calmly explaining that his acquisitions team was about to overvalue a tech startup by 30%, because they had completely missed a hidden liability clause buried in the footnotes. Julian stepped closer and stared at the numbers. His blood ran cold as he realized she was absolutely right. He looked down at her, his voice tight with suspicion, and asked how a waitress knew how to pass a high-level corporate merger document. Sienna gathered the papers quickly, a shadow of genuine, lingering pain crossing her delicate features. She stood up, holding the documents to her chest like a shield. She told him quietly that she wasn't always a waitress, and that his ruthless corporate world had a very funny way of erasing people when they were no longer deemed useful. Before he could demand any more answers, she turned and walked away down the long hallway, leaving Julian standing alone in the dim light, suddenly realizing that the woman he had married for sheer convenience was carrying a massive secret that might unravel everything he thought he knew. The morning after the incident in the kitchen, the atmosphere in the penthouse shifted. Julian could not stop watching her. At a high-profile charity gala later that week, the elite whispered behind their hands as Sienna walked in wearing a deep emerald gown that clung perfectly to her frame. Vanessa Sterling, unable to accept her defeat, cornered them near the balcony. She offered a sickly, sweet smile and loudly commented that it was so generous of Julian to rescue a struggling caterer from the slums, asking if Sienna even knew which fork to use for the oyster course. Without missing a beat, Sienna smiled back. She replied smoothly that she was perfectly familiar with the cutlery, but she found that dealing with bottom feeders required much sharper tools. Julian fought to hide a smirk, his hand resting firmly and possessively on the small of her back. The sudden, intense spark of pride he felt for her was entirely unscripted, but the facade of their invincibility cracked later that night. A sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled over the city, rattling the heavy glass windows of the penthouse. Julian walked into the living room to find Sienna curled tightly on the sofa, her hands clamped over her ears, breathing in rapid, shallow gasps. Her fierce armor was completely gone. Without a word, he sat beside her in the dark. He did not offer empty platitudes or try to touch her without permission. Instead, he pulled a thick cashmere blanket over her shoulders and quietly talked about mundane things: the history of the city skyline, the architectural flaws of the buildings across the river, keeping his voice low and steady until her breathing finally slowed. It was a small silent gesture of care, far more intimate than any public kiss they had shared for the cameras. The next morning, Julian called Elliot into his private office, locking the door behind him. He ordered a complete, unredacted background check on Sienna Hayes, specifically targeting her employment history. When Elliot returned hours later, his face was pale. He placed a thin, heavily classified folder on Julian's desk. Sienna had not just been a corporate worker, she had been a brilliant junior risk analyst working right there at Ashford Group. 6 months ago, she had flagged massive, deliberate discrepancies in the offshore accounts managed by Marcus Devereaux, a senior board member and Julian's uncle. Before she could bring the evidence to Julian, she was abruptly fired by Marcus, blacklisted from the financial sector, and threatened with legal ruin. Julian felt a sickening drop in his stomach as the truth clicked into place. He stormed back to the penthouse, his heart pounding with cold fury, not at her but at his own blind negligence. He found Sienna in the library and dropped the file onto the table. He asked her, his voice rough with emotion, why she had never told him she was destroyed by his own company. Sienna looked at the file, her eyes hardening into glass. The pain in her voice was devastating. She accused him of knowing the truth all along. She believed he had married her purely to keep her trapped, controlled and silent, a convenient way to neutralize a liability while securing his inheritance. She refused to listen to his desperate denials. For the next 3 weeks, a suffocating winter fell over their marriage. Sienna retreated into complete polite silence. She played the perfect, adoring wife in public, smiling for the cameras and holding his hand, but the moment they stepped behind closed doors, she became a ghost. She locked herself in the guest bedroom, answering his questions only with cold one-word replies. The silent punishment tore at him more than any screaming match ever could. Julian realized that his usual methods of throwing money at a problem would only insult her further. He stopped buying her diamonds and designer bags. Instead, he started paying attention. He noticed she studied late into the night, so he began waking up at dawn to brew her coffee exactly the way she liked it, black with a single pinch of cinnamon, leaving the steaming mug on the kitchen counter before he left for the office. When a crucial board meeting was scheduled in London, Julian abruptly cancelled his flight, choosing to take the loss just so he would not have to leave her alone in a city that had already chewed her up once. He wanted to show her that he was not the monster who had ruined her life. But their fragile progress was about to be shattered. Marcus Devereaux had finally connected the dots. Recognizing Sienna at a recent press event, the corrupt board member realized the analyst he had crushed was now sleeping in the master suite of the CEO. Panic set in. Knowing Sienna could expose his embezzlement at any moment, Marcus reached out to Vanessa Sterling. Together they orchestrated a massive, devastating media leak. The morning papers exploded with scandalous headlines. They painted Sienna as a calculating corporate spy and an opportunistic gold digger who had orchestrated her own firing just to seduce Julian and steal Ashford Group's trade secrets. The penthouse phone began ringing endlessly, and the lobby of their building flooded with aggressive paparazzi. Marcus called an emergency meeting of the board, demanding Julian be stripped of his CEO title for marrying a known corporate saboteur. The threat was absolute, and Sienna, staring out the window at the flashing cameras below, realized that she was about to lose everything all over again. The emergency board meeting was a shark tank, waiting for blood. Julian pushed open the heavy oak doors of the boardroom, his hand gripping Sienna's tightly. They walked in together, presenting a united front that immediately silenced the whispers. Marcus sat at the head of the table, a smug, victorious smile plastered across his face, with Vanessa standing near the back, eagerly waiting for Sienna's absolute destruction. Marcus stood up, loudly declaring that Julian's reckless marriage to a corporate spy had jeopardized the entire legacy of the Ashford Group, demanding an immediate vote of no confidence to remove Julian as CEO. Sienna did not shrink back. She gently let go of Julian's hand and walked straight to the digital projector at the front of the room. She calmly pulled a sleek, silver drive from her pocket and plugged it into the console. She looked directly at Marcus, her voice ringing out clear and unshakable. She explained that she was indeed a risk analyst, and she was very good at her job, which was exactly why she kept encrypted backups of the offshore ledgers before she was unjustly terminated. The massive screen behind her flickered to life, displaying irrefutable, crystal-clear banking records tracing millions of embezzled company funds directly into Marcus Devereaux's private accounts. The boardroom erupted in chaos. Marcus's face drained of all color. He stammered, frantically pointing at Sienna, shouting that the documents were forged, a desperate lie fabricated by a bitter ex-employee. But the board members were already scrolling through the live data, matching the dates and accounts. Vanessa, realizing she was standing on a sinking ship, immediately tried to distance herself, loudly claiming she had no idea about the fraud and was manipulated. Marcus, furious and cornered, turned on her instantly, screaming that Vanessa had paid off the journalists to leak the story. Security was called before the shouting could escalate further. The board voted unanimously on the spot, completely stripping Marcus of his shares and titles. He was dragged out of the building in front of flashing cameras, publicly humiliated and permanently ruined. Later that evening, the penthouse was quiet, but the heavy tension of the past few weeks was gone. Julian found Sienna standing on the balcony, looking out over the city lights that no longer seemed so cold. He stepped outside, handing her a sealed envelope. He told her it was the annulment paperwork and the $2 million, entirely free and clear. He explained that she had saved his company and his legacy, and she owed him absolutely nothing. His voice broke slightly as he confessed that he had been blind and arrogant, and that the greatest mistake of his life was not seeing her true value from the very beginning. Sienna looked down at the envelope. She did not open it. She looked up at Julian, seeing the raw, unguarded vulnerability in his eyes. He wasn't the cold, calculating billionaire anymore. He was just a man, terrified of losing the one real thing he had finally found. She slowly tore the envelope in half, letting the heavy paper fall to the balcony floor. She stepped closer, reaching up to gently rest her hand against his cheek. She whispered that she never wanted his money. She only wanted a partner who would stand by her side in the storm. Julian wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her close, and kissed her. It was not a contract, and it was not for the cameras. It was a promise, deep and entirely real. A year later, the city skyline looked different to both of them. Sienna stood at the front of her newly opened independent financial auditing firm, a company dedicated exclusively to exposing corporate corruption and protecting vulnerable employees. Julian stood proudly in the front row as she cut the ribbon, holding her hand with genuine reverence. They had rebuilt their lives not on a foundation of inheritance or forced contracts, but on absolute trust and mutual respect. They left the grand opening together, walking out into the bright afternoon sun, ready to face whatever the world had to offer, knowing they would never have to face it alone. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good love story. Subscribe to the channel to follow the next stories. See you next time.
Editor. The infographic presents Julian Ashford and Sienna Hayes' relationship as a transformation from control and survival into trust and genuine partnership. At the beginning of the story, Julian treats marriage as a strategic solution to a corporate problem. His grandfather's will threatens his position, and he believes that money, contracts, and authority can protect him from losing control. Sienna enters the arrangement from a completely different position. She is facing unemployment, eviction, and medical expenses, yet she refuses to surrender her dignity. Their contract therefore begins with a powerful imbalance, but Sienna's boundaries immediately challenge Julian's assumption that wealth gives him the right to control every situation. The psychological themes in the infographic explain why both characters behave defensively. Julian hides vulnerability behind emotional distance, professional power, and financial influence. He has learned to view relationships as negotiations because the people around him often value his status more than his character. Sienna's guarded behavior comes from betrayal and institutional injustice. After discovering suspicious financial activity inside Ashford Group, she was fired, blacklisted, and pushed into financial instability. Her caution is not coldness. It is a form of protection created by trauma, humiliation, and the fear of being exploited again. Their relationship changes through small moments rather than dramatic declarations. Julian begins to respect Sienna after seeing her defend herself at the gala. Later, her ability to identify a serious financial error forces him to recognize that the woman society dismisses as a waitress is intelligent, experienced, and professionally capable. The thunderstorm scene becomes an important emotional turning point because Julian offers safety without demanding anything in return. He does not use money or authority. He simply stays beside her, respects her boundaries, and helps her regain control. This moment shows how trust is built through patience, consistency, and emotional presence. The infographic also highlights the social problems surrounding their story. Sienna is judged according to class, occupation, and appearance, while wealthy characters are protected by prestige and family influence. Vanessa's treatment of her reveals how service workers can be treated as invisible or inferior. Marcus Devereux represents corporate corruption and the abuse of institutional power. He is able to destroy Sienna's career because his position gives him greater credibility than a junior employee. Her experience reflects the risks faced by whistleblowers who challenge powerful systems without protection. The boardroom confrontation brings the psychological and social themes together. Sienna does not defeat Marcus through revenge, wealth, or social status. She uses evidence, professional competence, and courage. By exposing the offshore accounts, she reclaims the identity that was taken from her and proves that truth can challenge even deeply protected corruption. Julian's decision to stand beside her also shows his growth. He stops viewing her as part of a contract and begins treating her as an equal whose judgment and dignity matter. The final balcony scene completes their transformation. When Julian gives Sienna the annulment papers and the promised money, he finally releases his need for control. Sienna's decision to reject the payout is not a rejection of independence but a free choice to remain with a man who has learned accountability. Their love becomes real only when both are able to choose it without obligation. The story ultimately teaches that healthy relationships are not built on rescue, possession, or financial dependence. They are built when two people see each other clearly, respect each other's autonomy, confront injustice together, and replace fear with trust.